I'm Ryan Miller, game developer and educator. This first set of video tutorials I'm going to cover how to create a basic RPG with Unity 4. The first few videos are going to detail how to get your assets ready for Unity, how to set up your project, and how to set up player controls. You can make use of the other videos in my channel to set up characters and props using Maya and Photoshop. First thing we want to do is we want to open up any scenes that are going into Unity. In this case, I've got my player character. So I want to ensure before I export this character that mesh cleanup doesn't return any errors in the mesh. There are two 5-sided triangles for me to fix. I also want to make sure that everything in my outliner looks very organized. So in this case, all I have is my mesh and a set of joints for my character. There are no empty transforms, there's no remnants from a mirrored character being combined, there's no reference planes. This is simply just a very simple character mesh and the skeleton that influences it. I also want to make sure that there is as little history items as possible in the channel box for my character mesh. I can do that by selecting Edit, Delete All by Type, Non-Deformer History. That will get rid of any UV projections, any tweaks, any splits, anything in here that would conflict with the mesh going into Unity. I also want to open up the Hypershade, make sure there are no extra materials in the scene. In this case, I only have my player texture and a Lambert 1. That's ideal. Another failsafe we can do here is use File Optimize Scene Size. What this will do is this will go through the Maya scene and look for any extra nodes that are not in use and delete them. Now I'm confident that the scene is clean and it's ready to go into Unity. I'm going to open up Unity here and create a new project that we're going to use for this RPG. I'm just going to call it RPG_Unity, and I'm not going to use any of the built-in packs. Most important thing for me to do first is to set up all my folders that all my assets are going to go into. It's easiest to start this from the get-go, get into the habit of using proper folders and places to put things in, instead of having to clean up a messy project that's already spun out of control. So the first folder I'm going to create is called Resources. Resources folder is special in Unity because it will allow us to load things from runtime if we need to, without having to drag and drop items into the inspector. I'll say more about that later. Inside the resources, I'm going to create folders for each type of resource that we're going to have, each major resource. So the first one's going to be player. We'll also create one for enemies and another for terrain or environmental assets. Since we're going to start with player first, I'm going to open it up and put a sources folder inside. Sources folder inside player is going to house all of the source items for the player. So all the items that Unity uses indirectly. So this will be the Maya file, the animations, the textures for the character, and the scripts for the character. Inside the player folder, the only thing we should have is prefabs. Inside the source should be all the things that make up that prefab. So here I have my player.ma, player idle, and player walk, which is the naming convention for extra animation clips, as well as player texture.psd, which is my player's texture. I'm just going to drag those in to the sources folder. There they are. You'll notice that Unity automatically creates a materials folder for any material that exists in a Maya file. So we have those organized already, nice and clean inside a sources folder. I'm going to create a plane in our scene just so we have a grounding for our character here. I always like to zero out any new items that are created so I know they're at the center of the world. And we can drag our player in as well. By default, the material should be hooked up even if your project isn't properly set in Maya. For this project, I'm going to use unlit textures just to kind of keep the low poly feel. An important thing that we have to change when we're using animations from Maya is we have to change the animation type from generic to legacy. Unity 4 has a new animation system, and the new animation system kind of prefers that it be used over the Maya animation system. So if you switch your rig to legacy, shouldn't give you any trouble. Just click apply for that, and for any other clips. You can start writing the character controller now as well. So I'm just going to create a new C# script. We'll call it player movement. The player movement we're going to use in this project is going to be mouse driven as opposed to key or gamepad driven. We're going to use a Diablo style point and click system where wherever you click, a raycast will be drawn and the player will walk towards it. So we're going to need a player plane for that. This is a plane that we're using to raycast, and we're going to need a ray for the actual raycast to happen with. Target point to store where we actually clicked on that plane. The distance away of the click. Always nice to have a speed variable in there. And a velocity to be used for character movement. This is just temporary storage of a velocity. We don't need start for this. Everything is going to happen inside update. And since we're going to use a rigid body for the character, we're actually going to change this to fixed update. So we want the character to move when a mouse button is pressed down, so we start off with good old get mouse button. Notice how every time I open up a bracket, I'll proceed to close it down here as well. This is just so I don't forget to later. Much clearer, much harder to lose your brackets here as well. We do have animations on this character. My shortcut here for making sure the animation loops without having to actually loop the animation in the animation browser is this little if statement here. So basically it checks to see if the animation walk is playing, and if it's not playing, it'll play it. We can test that out pretty quickly as well. So we'll just grab our player, throw the script on. We also need to add an animation component here. So if we add miscellaneous animation clip, all we need to do is fill up this array with the clips that we have. So I'll choose idle and walk. There we go. And now when my mouse button is held down, he walks. Now for the tricky part. We are going to create a plane to raycast from to get this Diablo style click movement. So what I'm doing here is this line is actually procedurally creating a plane, much like the create primitives plane built into Unity. What I'm actually doing is creating a new plane. Vector 3 up is going to be the way it faces, and transform position is going to be where it exists. So this is a flat plane pointing up that's going to always be at the same location as the player. I'm also going to define the raycast we're going to use. So it's going to raycast from the camera. It's going to use a very handy function called screen point to ray. It's going to use mouse position with that. So what this will do is it'll create a ray starting from the camera, going forward where the mouse position lands, where we click. This is the actual raycast taking place. It's important that we have hit dist in here because this is where the raycast hit is actually going out to. Okay. So target point, ray.getPoint hit dist is actually going to get the 3D coordinate in space of where our mouse clicked. That's why we're writing all this raycast code down. So since we now have that that coordinate, we can now use that coordinate and our player to rotate our player towards where that click happened. That should be enough to test now, so let's try that. That should now rotate our character towards our mouse click. Good. So he's rotating and he's walking. Now all we need to do is get the player to actually translate forward when he's moving forward. In past tutorials I've used transform.translate for this, or we've actually edited the transform position of the character. Since this player is a rigid body, we're going to be moving it with rigid body to take advantage of the built-in collision, as well as other things. We want to edit the velocity instead of the position. What this is going to do is it's going to give us much better hit detection, it's going to give us predictive collision, and it's also going to allow us to move the character with less jitter. So the simplest way to do this is say rigid body.velocity is equal to transform.forward. Let's throw time speed in right now. I'm going to adjust my camera here too. Just going to give it more of a an overhead view here. There we go. Now we need a rigid body on the character. So under Add Component, Physics, Rigid Body, I'm going to apply one right away. Throw mass to 500, throw some angular drag in there so we don't get the character spinning. Extrapolate, and we'll freeze the rotations for X and Z so we don't get the character falling sideways or frontways. We want to keep the rotation on Y because we actually want to turn the character. In addition to the rigid body, we also need a collider on the player. So we'll just use a sphere collider for now. Position it where it will make sense. There we go, and give it a shot. There we go, so now we got a player walking around.